When I read my parents' will and saw they left everything to our cousin, the one they always called a real son, I quietly stopped covering their bills. A few weeks later, Mom texted, "Transfer the money for the mortgage." No greeting, no small talk. I simply replied. David Reynolds had always done what was expected of him. At 34, he lived alone in a modest apartment in Denver, Colorado, working as a systems analyst for a mid-sized software company. His life wasn't flashy, but was stable, carefully built piece by piece on quiet sacrifices. What few people knew, however, was that David had been quietly supporting his retired parents financially for over 6 years. It started small. A few grocery bills here, a surprise car repair there, then the family business, a quaint bookstore his parents had run for more than 2 decades, folded under the weight of rising rents and dwindling customers. That was when the request became steady, almost routine. First, it was the electricity bill, then the property taxes. Then, after his father's health declined and they had to refinance the house, the mortgage payments. David picked up each tab without complaint. He never told anyone. He never brought it up at family gatherings, never mentioned the missed vacations or postponed personal goals. He simply adjusted his life around the needs of his parents, believing, foolishly perhaps, that quiet love was stronger than loud gratitude. But gratitude never really came. His parents, especially his mother, rarely acknowledged the help. There were no thank yous, no notes, not even casual mentions. The support was treated as a given, an unspoken obligation, something he owed them simply by virtue of being born. And while David didn't expect applause, the absence of any appreciation created a growing vacuum in his chest. Worse than the lack of acknowledgement, though, was the way they talked about Ethan. Ethan, his cousin, was the golden boy. Flashy, charming, a little reckless, but always landing on his feet. He'd moved to California after college, bounced through a series of startup jobs, and visited once or twice a year, always with expensive gifts and stories about the tech world. His presence was magnetic. His absence was explained away with excuses. He's busy, he has a lot going on, he'll come around. David had always thought of Ethan as a brother, in that distant, slightly competitive way cousins sometimes do. But his parents talk about Ethan not just fondly, but reverently. "Our real son," his mother once whispered, half joking, to a neighbor during a Christmas party, not realizing David had overheard. He had smiled then, burying the sting deep down, as he carried more dishes into the kitchen. What made it worse was that Ethan had been nowhere during the hard years. When David's father had surgery, Ethan sent flowers. When the business collapsed, Ethan sent a vague, "sorry to hear that," text. When the mortgage payment started threatening foreclosure, Ethan was off on a trip to Greece, judging by his Instagram photos. He wasn't present. He wasn't paying. But somehow he was still the favorite. David didn't ask why. He already knew. His parents liked Ethan because he represented something they wished they had been. Carefree, successful in appearance, unattached. David, steady and reliable, reminded them of their own limits. It wasn't about love. It was about projection. Ethan looked like a win. David looked like a compromise. But David endured because that's what he did. He endured and he paid the bills. Month after month. Quietly. Invisibly. Until the day his father died. It wasn't sudden. The final weeks had been long and quiet, spent in hospice care, with David visiting daily. Ethan sent one bouquet of flowers and didn't attend the funeral. David didn't ask why. Again, he already knew. After the service, the lawyer's office contacted him. There was a will, they said, a formal reading. David assumed he was being called in to discuss the house, maybe to sign some paperwork. After all, he had been paying the mortgage. He had kept the lights on. He went alone, dressed in a black suit that no longer fit quite right, sat down across from the gray-haired attorney, and waited. And that was when everything began to unravel. The room was quieter than David expected. It was early in the afternoon when he arrived at the law office, a modest building in downtown Denver with thick carpeting and heavy wooden doors. The kind of place where sound seemed to disappear. The receptionist, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses, led him to a private office with a firm smile and a soft, "Mr. Reynolds is waiting inside." David entered, clutching a folder of bank statements and receipts. Instinctively, though he wasn't sure why, the attorney, Mitchell Reynolds, was no relative despite the shared surname. He stood as David entered, extended a firm hand, and motioned for him to sit across the dark mahogany desk. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reynolds. I know this must be a difficult time." David gave a polite nod, too tired to correct the assumption that the loss was fresh. The grief, if it existed at all anymore, was buried beneath months of slow decline, long nights at the hospital, and a quiet absence of real connection between father and son. What remained now was the dust of duty and a vague curiosity about the formalities ahead. Mitchell sat, flipped open a thin file, and adjusted his reading glasses. As per the request of the deceased, we are here for the official reading of the last will and testament of James Leonard Reynolds. The document was last updated and notarized 11 months ago, in the presence of 2 witnesses, both employees of this firm. Do you have any questions before we begin? David shook his head. He just wanted to get through it. Mitchell began to read, his voice measured and dispassionate. It started predictably. Full name, date of birth, legal affirmations. Then came the formal declarations of intent. I, James Leonard Reynolds, being of sound mind and body. David barely listened, his eyes wandering across the bookshelves behind the attorney, filled with leather-bound volumes that probably no one had opened in decades. Then the tone shifted. I bequeath all real estate assets, including the property at 1217 Willow Creek Lane, Denver, Colorado, along with the 2016 Ford Explorer currently parked on said property, to Ethan Maxwell Reynolds. David's gaze snapped back to Mitchell. Surely there was a pause, a comma, a continuation, but the attorney kept going. All remaining savings accounts, including the joint retirement fund with my wife, Linda Marie Reynolds, and the Charles Schwab investment account, are to be transferred immediately upon certification of death to Ethan Maxwell Reynolds. David blinked. He wasn't mishearing. He waited for the next clause. There was none, no mention of him, not even a sentence acknowledging his existence. No sentimental letter tucked into the back of the file. No symbolic item left behind. Not the watch his father wore every Sunday. Not the dog tags from his time in the Army. Nothing. The will was over in less than 4 minutes. When Mitchell looked up, his expression shifted just slightly, enough to register that he was aware of the discomfort now hanging in the room. I'm sure this is unexpected, he offered cautiously. David didn't speak. He nodded once, too slowly, like he hadn't yet processed what he heard. Mitchell hesitated. I wasn't involved in the drafting of the original will, but I can confirm this was updated just under a year ago. Your father was specific. Legally, there's no ambiguity. Still, David said nothing. You're not obligated to make any decisions now, the lawyer continued. You're welcome to request a copy. You can contest the will, though I'll be honest, it's difficult to argue undue influence unless there's evidence. And there isn't any to my knowledge. David let out a breath, long and hollow. No, thank you, he said quietly. There's no need for a copy. Mitchell nodded. Would you like me to inform Ethan of the execution of the will? David stood slowly, smoothing out the front of his jacket. I'm sure he already knows. He left the office in silence, stepping back into the bright afternoon sunlight that felt somehow out of place. The city continued on around him. People walking, cars honking, someone shouting about coffee from a food truck. Life, indifferent and relentless. He sat in his car for nearly an hour, unmoving, engine off, the document echoing in his head like a riddle with no answer. He thought about calling someone, maybe a friend or an old college roommate, but the weight of explaining was too heavy, the shame too sharp. Instead, he drove to his apartment. Inside, he placed a folder of receipts, those months of proof that had been the one keeping things afloat, on his kitchen table. Then he sat, staring at them, trying to make sense of the decision. Why? That question rang louder than anything else. Why Ethan, the cousin who hadn't visited in years, who never showed up at the hospital, who sent texts full of exclamation marks and empty promises? The cousin who lived in Los Angeles now, who had once joked about selling the Denver house for Airbnb money. Why give him everything? David thought of calling his mother, but something inside him froze. There had been no mention of him in the will, But there had also been no protest from her in all those months. No sign that she had pushed back. She must have known. She must have agreed. The realization settled in slowly. This wasn't just about James Reynolds. It was about both of them. He didn't eat that night. He didn't sleep much either. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he found himself walking barefoot to the living room, opening the drawer where he kept their old mail, bills with his name on the payment line, medical invoices, tax reminders. He flipped through them like evidence in a case already lost. He had spent nearly $18,000 over the last year and a half. $18,000 to help keep a house that wasn't his, for parents who apparently didn't see him as theirs. By morning, he knew exactly what he would do. Not revenge, not confrontation. He had no energy for theatrics, just silence. He would stop. No more payments. No more transfers. No more calls to the bank on their behalf. He would vanish from their spreadsheet of support the same way they had erased him from the page of the will. They made their choice. Now he would make his. The first missed payment came and went without a sound. It was the middle of the month when David let the automatic transfer for the mortgage lapse. He watched the due date pass like a mile marker on a long road. No alarms, no emails, no frantic calls. Just silence. It was both surreal and anticlimactic. He had imagined foolishly that there might be an immediate reaction, a text from his mother, perhaps a confused phone call. But the quiet that followed was deeper than expected, and in some ways more painful. It wasn't just the absence of thanks anymore. It was the absence of notice. No one even realized he was gone. The silence stretched on for days. David kept going to work, logging into Zoom meetings, answering emails. His co-workers didn't notice the slight shift in his tone, the colder edge to his voice when talking about deadlines. They still asked about his weekend plans, and he still gave vague answers. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not about the will, not about Ethan, not about the decision he'd made. There was no point. One evening, after a long day spent debugging legacy code, he sat on his couch with a beer and opened the family group chat, one that had remained dormant for months. The last message had been a blurry photo his mother sent of a lasagna she had made. Ethan had replied with a thumbs up. David had said nothing. Now, as he scrolled to the older messages, he saw years' worth of holiday photos, generic encouragements, small jokes, the kind of thread that looked alive on the surface but lacked any real substance. Most of the messages were from his mother or Ethan. His father rarely typed, preferring short calls David had answered, even when they came at odd hours. Now, he wondered if any of those conversations had ever really meant something to his father, or if they had just been convenient. He deleted the chat. The second bill to come due was the electricity. The power company sent a paper notice to his parents' house. He knew, because he had arranged that before. He waited again. Nothing. Then came the credit card. Then the internet. One by one, the small financial veins that kept the household running began to collapse, and still, no response. David didn't feel triumphant. He didn't even feel angry anymore. What he felt was a strange hollowness, like a man who had let go of a rope after pulling it for too long, only to realize he wasn't holding anything important at the end of it. One afternoon, a letter arrived at his apartment. Handwritten. No envelope. It had been slipped under his door. His name scrawled across the front in all caps. David. He opened it cautiously. Inside was a short note, written on lined notebook paper. I don't know what's going on with the payments. Your mother is acting like nothing's wrong, but she's scared. Just thought you should know. Aunt Claire. David stared at the signature for a long time. Aunt Claire was his mother's younger sister, the one relative who had always felt like a neutral observer in the family's theater of favoritism. She didn't meddle, didn't take sides, but she saw things. She noticed. He folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen table beside his unopened stack of bills. He didn't respond. The first voicemail came a few days later. It wasn't from his mother. It was from a bank representative, alerting him that the joint credit card he had co-signed was approaching its limit. He knew that, of course. He had stopped paying. But hearing the confirmation from a stranger's voice made it real in a different way. 2 days later, the phone finally rang. This time it was her David watched the screen light up. Mom. He didn't answer. He watched it ring until it stopped, then waited for the voicemail notification. There was none. That silence. Again, that night, as rain tapped lightly against the windows of his apartment. David sat at his desk and opened an old photo folder on his computer. It contained pictures from birthdays, vacations, random afternoons from years ago. He hadn't looked at them in a long time. Most were poorly lit or out of focus, but they were memories all the same. He clicked through them, slowly. There was one of them as a teenager, holding a baseball glove, his father standing behind him, barely smiling. Another, more recent, from a family barbecue 3 summers ago. David at the grill, Ethan lounging in a lawn chair, beer in hand, surrounded by laughter. David hadn't been included in that conversation. He remembered that clearly now. He closed the folder. A week passed. Then came the text. No greeting. No explanation. Transfer the money for the mortgage. David read the message twice. That was it. No, hi. No, hope you're well. Not even a question mark. Just an imperative, like a command from a boss who had grown too used to obedience. He stared at the phone for a long time. The weight of everything he had carried. All the months of support, all the invisible labor, all the things he had never said, tightened in his chest like a vice. He didn't think. He didn't rehearse. He typed, "You should ask your real son." He sent it. Immediately. No edits. No follow-up. Then he placed the phone face down and walked to the sink to wash the dishes, as if nothing had happened. But his hands trembled as the water ran. Minutes passed. Then the phone vibrated once. Then again. Then again. 5 missed calls in the span of half an hour. 2 voicemails. 3 texts, all from her. He didn't look right away. He couldn't. He stood at the kitchen window instead, watching the city darken, the lights flickering on in rows across nearby apartment buildings. He felt the same strange emptiness he felt the day of the will, only now it was clearer, sharper. When he finally picked up the phone, he played the first voicemail. His mother's voice, trembling, angry. "How dare you? After everything we've done for you? Do you have any idea what this is doing to me? We are losing everything." There it was, the shift. No mention of Ethan. No admission of what had been done. Just guilt, accusation, panic. He didn't respond. He played the second voicemail. This one was quieter. "I don't know what's happening with you, David, but this isn't how we raised you. You don't just abandon your family like this. You're better than that." David nearly laughed. He had always been better than that. He had always done more than expected. He had been the quiet, loyal son, the one who stayed behind, the one who paid, the one who listened. And none of it had mattered in the end. Not enough to be remembered in a will. Not enough to be seen. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he let the silence grow into something else. Resolve. The silence was no longer a punishment. It was protection, and he wasn't going to break it first. The next morning, David woke up earlier than usual. His phone was silent, but the tension lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. He brewed coffee slowly, methodically, his mind turning over every word from a night before. He had not responded to his mother's voicemails. He didn't plan to, but he knew that something had shifted now, irreversibly. By 8 o'clock, he had received another text. "Mortgage is late. Just send it now so we don't get flagged. I'll explain to the bank later." There was a confidence in the tone that unsettled him, not desperation, not fear. It was still a command, as if the last 24 hours hadn't happened, as if his text about their real son had been a glitch in an otherwise reliable system. It wasn't even passive aggression anymore. It was expectation in its purest form. He put the phone away, picked up his laptop, and logged into work. Throughout the day, his phone buzzed periodically. His mother sent 2 more messages, both variations of the same request. Not once did she ask how he was. Not once did she reference the will. And certainly, not once did she ask why he had stopped paying. The silence wasn't mutual now. She had broken it, but only in service of her own convenience. By lunchtime, the text stopped. David assumed she had moved on to calling someone else. Maybe Aunt Claire, maybe the bank itself, maybe even Ethan, though the idea of her asking him for anything after what they had done felt like a stretch. At around 2 in the afternoon, his phone rang again. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, then checked the transcript a few minutes later. It was from the mortgage lender's office. Polite, professional, but firm. The payment was overdue, and if it remained unpaid, late fees would be added. They encouraged him to call if there had been any changes in circumstances. He deleted the message. That evening, the cold came back, literal this time. Denver had entered a sudden cold snap, and David turned up the heat as he changed into sweats. He walked around the apartment, restless, the weight of inertia pressing down on him. He hadn't told anyone about the fallout. Not friends, not co-workers, not even his therapist, whom he hadn't seen in months. He opened the fridge, pulled out a frozen pizza, then paused. He didn't feel like eating. He sat back down and reopened the photo folder he had browsed a few nights earlier. This time, he didn't look at the images. He started deleting them, one by one, not in anger, not in spite, just release. Photos of Ethan being celebrated, of his parents hugging him at graduation, of that family cruise David had paid for but ended up skipping because of a work emergency, and then saw pictures of his parents smiling next to Ethan, captioned just like old times. Delete, delete, delete. It was cleansing in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't delete everything. Some images stayed, ones that had nothing to do with family, college friends, old roommates, a beach sunset he had captured in Mexico 6 years ago, during the only real vacation he'd taken as an adult. He looked at the image and felt something unfamiliar. Peace. His phone buzzed again. A single message. Ethan's not answering me. You need to pay this, David. You've always handled it. Just do it. He stared at it, trying to understand the sheer audacity in her tone. He closed the phone and left it on the table. The next day, he received an email from the internet provider linked to his parents' account. The service was suspended due to non-payment. It was registered under his name, a decision he'd made years ago when their previous provider hiked up the rates. Back then, it had seemed easier to just handle it himself. Fewer calls for them, fewer complaints. One more convenience David had provided without ever being asked. He replied with a brief email asking for the account to be closed permanently. He confirmed he would no longer be responsible for any charges. Then he opened another tab and checked the payment history on the credit card he had co-signed. The last charge had been a grocery run, nearly $300. Before that, a payment to a pharmacy. A recurring charge from a cable provider. None of it extravagant, but all of it constant. David clicked through the statements, watching the months unfurl like chapters in someone else's life. A life he had subsidized without question. No more. That weekend, he drove to the foothills outside Denver, alone. He brought a notebook, something he had once used to sketch designs during college, and found a bench overlooking a quiet trail. He sat for hours, not writing, not sketching, just sitting. People passed by, couples with dogs, hikers, parents pushing strollers. No one looked at him twice. For once, David felt invisible in a way that comforted him. Later that night, back in the apartment, he finally opened a text chain with his old friend Marcus, who had moved to Seattle years ago. They hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer. He typed, "Ever thought about moving somewhere just to start over?" Marcus replied 2 hours later, "Every damn week." It made David laugh genuinely, the kind of laugh that caught him off guard. That small connection reminded him of something vital. Not all relationships were transactions. Some people cared without strings attached. Some conversations were just that, conversations, not obligations. The next morning, he received a call. It was her again. This time, he picked up not because he was ready to talk, but because he needed to hear what she would say when there were no messages left to send. Her voice was sharp. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, David, but this is serious. The bank is calling. The power company is threatening shut off. This is your family's home." He waited a beat, then replied, his voice even, "No, It's Ethan's home. That's what the will said. Silence. Then, you know what your father meant. That house was always. No, he interrupted. I know exactly what he meant. And so do you. The silence returned. This time it was hers. He ended the call. No yelling. No drama. Just clarity. The first cold demand had come. But so had his final answer. The morning after that final phone call, David awoke to find his phone dead. Not from battery, but from silence. No new messages. No missed calls. No emails. The usual digital hum of his world had gone quiet. The absence wasn't comforting anymore. It was a kind of silence that followed a severed connection, the kind that signaled a shift too large to reverse. He made breakfast, staring blankly at his plate as the eggs cooled. He wasn't hungry, but he needed the routine. He needed to anchor himself to something tangible, because beneath the surface of his calm, a storm had begun to build. Not a storm of regret or guilt, but of clarity. And with it, an unsettling question lingered. Had it always been this broken? He didn't go to work that day. He called in and said he needed a personal day. His manager, who had always been understanding, gave him the space. David took the opportunity not to rest, but to organize. He pulled out folders he hadn't touched in years, financial records, notarized documents, printouts of email receipts, everything that proved just how deeply he had entangled himself in his parents' financial survival. He highlighted every payment he had made toward the mortgage in the past 15 months, then the utilities, then the credit card charges. The total was now staggering, more than $22,000. $22,000 he would never see again. He made copies of everything and neatly filed them away. He didn't know what he would do with them yet. He wasn't planning to sue or demand reimbursement. That wasn't the point. The point was to stop pretending it hadn't happened. Around midday, his phone lit up again, not with his mother's number, but a new one, Los Angeles area code. He didn't have to guess. He let it ring, then checked the voicemail a few minutes later. Hey, man, it's Ethan. The voice was exactly how he remembered, relaxed, casual, like they were calling to catch up over beers. I don't know what kind of drama you got going on with Aunt Linda, but she's been calling me nonstop. Says the house stuff is falling apart. Look, I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know the will said that until after the funeral. Okay, I didn't want to get in the middle of this. But honestly, maybe it's better this way. There was a pause. I mean, you were always kind of distant. You never really click with them, you know? Anyway, I'm not looking to fight about this. If you want to talk, let's talk. If not, whatever. Do your thing. David listened to the message twice. That last sentence. You were always kind of distant, stuck in his throat like a shard of glass. Distant. What a word. Small. Casual. Convenient. As if absence had been a choice. As if Ethan, from his beachside apartment 2 states away, had any understanding of what it meant to show up day after day, bill after bill. As if proximity were emotional currency, and David had chosen not to spend his. He stood up, paced the room once, then grabbed his phone. He typed quickly, without pause and question. You have no idea what I've done for them. You've never cared to know. Enjoy your house. He hit send. A minute later, the 3 dots appeared. Ethan typing. David didn't wait to read it. He muted the thread, put his phone on the counter, and walked out the door. He drove without direction for a while, winding through downtown, past old haunts he barely recognized. Construction had changed everything. Places he used to visit were gone or replaced. It felt like the city was moving on without him. Maybe he needed to do the same. He found himself in front of the old bookstore his parents used to own. It had been turned into a boutique pet supply shop. The sign above the door was still the same shape, but the name was different, the colors brighter. He didn't go in. He just stood outside for a moment, looking at the place that had defined so much of their family's identity, and, in many ways, its downfall. He thought about the years his parents had poured into that shop, the holidays they had worked, the evenings they had stayed late. And when it all failed, when they had nothing left but debt and a house they could barely afford, it had been David who kept them afloat. And yet, in the end, it was Ethan who had inherited the memory of that struggle. Ethan, who had stayed away. The injustice wasn't just legal, it was emotional. It was historical. Back home, as the sun began to dip, David received a new text, this time from his mother. He says he's selling the house. You need to talk to him. He's going to ruin everything. No preamble, no apology, not even acknowledgement of their last conversation. He stared at the screen, then slowly typed, "You made your decision. Live with it." He didn't send it right away. His thumb hovered over the button. But then he remembered the phone call, the voicemails, the will. He remembered the lasagna photo, the real son comment, the years of absence repackaged as charm. He pressed send. No response came. He turned off his phone, sat at his desk, and opened his email. He began drafting a message to a realtor, not about his parents' house, about finding a place of his own, something small, something with light, something that didn't carry the weight of the past. He didn't know how long it would take, but the search felt like something solid, something his, not inherited, not demanded, not shared. That night, he slept deeply for the first time in weeks, not because things were resolved, but because, for the first time, he had nothing left to explain. 2 days passed without a word. No texts, no calls, no voicemails. For a while, David wondered if his last message had finally drawn the line deep enough that even she wouldn't cross it. But then on the third morning, as he poured coffee into his chipped navy blue mug, his phone rang. Not a number this time. Her name, clearly displayed. Mom. He let it ring until the voicemail prompt ended it. A few seconds later, the notification buzzed. The message was long, over 2 minutes. Her voice was low at first, as if rehearsed. "David, I'm trying to understand what you're doing. This isn't like you. I know you're upset about the will, but there are things you don't know, and this isn't the way to handle them." She paused, exhaled, then continued with a sharper edge. "I don't know what Ethan said to you, but he didn't ask for the house. He didn't demand it. Your father, he made that decision. I didn't agree with it either, but it was done. And now, you're just abandoning me? After everything we've done for you?" That line, "everything we've done for you," landed like a slap. He closed the voicemail. There was no mention of the money, no recognition of the years of support, no apology, just justification layered with guilt. The manipulation was no longer subtle. It was clear, intentional, refined through years of unspoken rules and assumed debts. David walked to the window and stared at the street below, watching people pass. He wondered how many others had these kind of conversations with their families. Conversations where love was measured in silence, where loyalty was a tool, not a gift. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Ethan. "Look, she's freaking out. Says you're ignoring her. I told her to calm down, but honestly, she's a mess. You might want to say something before she loses it completely." No punctuation, no real concern. Just a vague acknowledgement that the burden had shifted, however briefly, from David to someone else. For a split second, David considered calling, not to explain himself, but to end it, to lay everything bare in one final conversation. But even that, he realized, would be a concession, a closing act she hadn't earned. Instead, he went back to the folder of financial documents and drafted a short email. Subject, accounts closed. Body, I've canceled the utility services registered under my name. I will not be resuming any financial support. I recommend you and Ethan work out a plan moving forward. Best, David. He hit send. A minute later, a response arrived. Short, no salutation. "I don't know who you are anymore." He didn't reply. That afternoon, his doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. Cautious, he checked the peephole and was surprised to see a woman standing there, small frame, familiar jacket. Aunt Claire. He opened the door slowly. "Hi," she said gently, holding a paper bag. "I brought sandwiches." He stepped aside, letting her in without a word. The scent of pastrami and mustard filled the entryway. They sat on his small couch. She placed the bag on the table, but didn't touch it. "I thought you could use some company," she said. David gave a small nod. "Thanks." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Then she finally spoke. She called me this morning. Claire said you've changed, that you're punishing her. David didn't respond right away. I'm not punishing anyone, he said finally. I'm just done pretending. Claire studied him for a long moment. I believe you. I do. But she's unraveling David. I went by the house yesterday. She hasn't been eating. She barely talks. She keeps pacing the kitchen, muttering about Ethan, the mortgage, the neighbors. She's scared. David let out a breath. And yet she still won't say sorry, he said. No, Claire agreed. She won't. He turned to face her. Do you think she ever will? Claire didn't answer immediately. Then softly, I don't know. The words hung in the air like dust in sunlight. After she left, David sat in the silence she had left behind. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't bitter. It was honest. The silence of people who had said what they could and knew there was nothing left to do but wait. That night, a knock came at the door. Not the buzzer. A knock. 3 times. Cautious again, he opened the door, only to find a box left on the mat. No note, no signature, just his name written in a hurried scrawl. He brought it inside and opened it. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Some he remembered, some he had never seen. His childhood birthdays, vacations, school plays. At the bottom of the pile, a small envelope. He opened it, expecting another note, maybe a letter. Instead, it contained a single Polaroid. His father, standing next to Ethan, arm around his shoulder. Behind them, the house. On the back, scribbled in ink, for everything you'll never understand. There was no name, no explanation, just that cryptic message. David stared at the photo for a long time, heart slowing, breath catching in his throat. Whatever it meant, it wasn't closure. It was a wound reopened. He placed the photo on the table, next to his coffee mug, and turned out the lights. He didn't cry, but he didn't sleep either. A week after the box arrived, David's phone rang in the early afternoon. It was Ethan. Direct call, not voicemail. The sound startled him, as though it had broken the tension in the room. He looked at the screen, hesitated, then answered. Hello, David. Ethan said, his tone measured. We need to talk, face to face. There was nothing urgent in Ethan's voice, but something behind it. Restlessness, maybe anxiety. David didn't reply immediately. Where are you? Ethan asked. Denver. David said, Okay, I'm flying in tonight. I want to see you tomorrow afternoon. The line went dead. David stared at the phone for a moment, fingers hovering over the buttons, before setting it down. The call stirred something he had been suppressing. A mix of dread, curiosity, and a cautious hope that maybe this meeting could be more than posturing. That night, sleep was shallow. He lay in bed, restless, turning over possibilities. What did Ethan want? Was it an apology? Was it damage control? Or was it a challenge? He had no illusions. Ethan was unpredictable, but he agreed. He had to. The next morning, he texted Ethan. Where and when? Minutes later, Cafe Luna, 2 o'clock. I'll cover it. Cafe Luna was a small, cozy place tucked into a side street, the kind of neighborhood spot with mismatched chairs and the scent of cinnamon baked goods. He arrived just before 2. Ethan was already there, seated at a corner table, legs crossed, looking well-traveled and unhurried. Ethan stood as David approached, extended his hand awkwardly. David took it. Thanks for meeting, Ethan said. Sitting again, David nodded once, then studied him across the table. The cafe noise, clinking cups, soft conversation, baristas calling out orders, filled the space between them. So, Ethan began, hands folded. I wasn't sure you'd show. David said nothing. You know, Ethan continued, I never asked for the will to be like that. It just ended up that way. I didn't want to inherit everything. I didn't. David thought about the phone message, how Ethan sounded casual. He looked different in person. Older, more deflated, a little foreign in his own family. Then why didn't you contest it? David asked. Ethan's face flickered. I tried, he said quietly, But Mom and Dad, they were firm. They had their reasons. Things I didn't fully understand until later. There was pressure, a lot of pressure. Deals, expectations. I was being groomed, for lack of a better term. They always believed you'd take over things here in Denver. Financially, emotionally, but I guess they lost faith over time. I don't know. He rubbed a hand across his face, as though trying to erode the memory. David let the silence hang. Ethan exhaled. I didn't come here to fight you, he said finally. I came to explain, to make sense of it. We're family, whether it feels that way or not. And this mess does none of us good. Not really. Even as Ethan spoke, David could feel the walls around him. The years of resentment, the weight of obligations unacknowledged. He wanted to believe, but trust was brittle. You gave up the house, David said. On purpose or not, doesn't matter. It's gone to you. Ethan's eyes flickered. There were conditions you might not have known about, he admitted. Financial partners, liens, unpaid loans. Mom and Dad were squeezed tight. They were ashamed to tell you. They thought it would upset you, maybe make you feel obligated in ways you weren't ready for. Obscure excuses, but there was vulnerability in Ethan's tone now, a ragged edge of disbelief at how the narrative had spiraled. I paid nothing, David said. Not 1 cent after the will. You think that absolves you? That you're innocent? Ethan flinched at the accusation. No, I'm not innocent. I don't expect you to believe me all at once, but I'm asking you to try to see things from my side too. He paused and leaned forward. Look, there was a letter Dad wrote to you, I think, but he never sent it. I found it among old files. He regretted a lot. He talked about you being the one holding everything together. He called you loyal, dependable. He said he was frightened you'd leave him behind. David's chest tightened. He thought of the Polaroid, the cryptic message, the box of photos, the will, the long roads he had walked. Here was a ghost of explanation, but it might be too late. Ethan slid a folder across the table. The edges were crisp. David picked it up. Inside were copies of letters, account statements, and financial records. They showed a trail of debt, obligations, partner claims. They showed how the property was partially mortgaged beyond what David had known. Strange deals with investors. That the house wasn't unencumbered. That parts of it were already pledged as collateral against loans David never knew existed. This isn't justification, Ethan said quietly. It's what I found after. Maybe it changes nothing for you, but it could explain why they left it the way they did. David pinched the bridge of his nose. His heart felt like it was fracturing. So they gambled away and left the wreckage to me, or you, he said. Ethan shook his head. No, they thought they were protecting you. They decided you shouldn't know. They thought you'd refuse or feel betrayed. They were scared. He looked away, then back. I know how it looks. I know what you've done. I'm not defending you, but I'm asking to be heard. Could we find a way forward? Maybe sell it. Divide stuff fairly. Make peace. I don't want war. David closed the folder without looking at the contents again. He stood. This is too late, he said. Not because you don't matter. Because I don't want to return to a life where I'm measured by debt or gratitude. I'm no one's safety net. Ethan stood too, face pale. So that's it? David slowed, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out the Polaroid, the one from the box, his father and Ethan in front of the house. He laid it on the table between them. You got everything they valued, he said. Maybe this symbol matters more to them than it matters to me. But I keep this, for memory or pity. I don't know yet. He turned and walked away before Ethan could respond, passed through the cafe door into the street. The cold air hit him. The city moved around him. Behind him, he heard Ethan's chair scrape. He heard a voice calling out, David, wait, but he didn't stop. He walked until his legs burned, until the cry in his chest dulled. In the sky, clouds drifted across the sun, making the world go gray, and he felt for the first time like he was truly changing course. The following morning came quietly, gray light seeping to the blinds of David's apartment. He had expected his sleep to be restless after the meeting with Ethan, but instead, he had slept deeply, like his body had needed a night without obligation, without defense. Still, As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of what had been said the day before pulled at him. Ethan's words lingered, not because they changed anything, but because they revealed just how far the rot had spread. David rose, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where the folder Ethan had handed him still lay unopened. He didn't reach for it. The details were no longer the issue. He didn't need more evidence of chaos or justifications, or confusion masquerading as guilt. What he needed was distance. But distance, it seemed, wasn't something his mother intended to give. Around 10 o'clock, his phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then answered. A woman's voice greeted him, formal and polite. "Mr. Reynolds? This is Diane. I'm calling from Elder Bridge Support Services. Your mother, Linda Reynolds, listed you as an emergency contact. She requested a counselor reach out on her behalf." David blinked. "A counselor?" "Yes. She's requested assistance. Emotional support, housing advice, legal aid. She mentioned recent family conflict and said you were a key figure." He said nothing. The counselor continued. "She asked us to inform you that she's overwhelmed and afraid of losing her home. She said her son, her words, cut her off and walked away, and that she doesn't know what to do." David closed his eyes. This was the next play, a public appeal, a narrative rewritten and delivered through third parties to elicit sympathy, to reframe the situation in the gentlest terms, where she was an abandoned parent and he, the cold son who disappeared. "I appreciate the call," he said, "but I think my mother has left out some important context." There was a pause. "I understand. These situations are always complex," Diane said carefully. "If you're open to it, we offer mediation services. Safe, structured conversations." David exhaled. "I'm not interested, but thank you." He ended the call, then turned off his phone entirely. The manipulation had begun its final evolution, emotional blackmail cloaked in vulnerability. Later that afternoon, he received a knock on the door. For a moment, he thought it might be Ethan again, or even his mother, unannounced. But when he opened it, it was Claire. Her face was drawn, eyes tired. "Can I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside. Once inside, she sat heavily on the couch. "She's unraveling," Claire said without preamble. "She told the church group you've gone cold, that you're shutting her out after everything she sacrificed. Some of the women are calling to check in on her. She's building the story now, David, the one where you're the villain." David nodded slowly. "She wants control, and when she loses it, she weaponizes pity." Claire didn't argue. She said Ethan is threatening to sell, that she begged him not to. She says she has nowhere to go, that you abandoned her, just like your father did at the end. The last part stung, even though David knew better. His father hadn't abandoned anyone. He had simply chosen silence over reconciliation. David had inherited that silence. "She's asking me to intervene," Claire continued. "She wants me to bring you back. Like you're a prodigal child who just needs a nudge." David laughed, but it was bitter. "She never believed I would walk away," he said. "She thought guilt would keep me tethered forever." Claire's voice was quiet. "Isn't that what she raised you on?" He said nothing. "David, I'm not here to take sides," she added. "I'm just worried, not just about her, about you too. I've never seen you this angry." "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm just done." She left without pushing him further, but the heaviness she carried lingered in the apartment long after the door closed. That evening, with his phone still off, David logged onto his laptop and opened his personal email. Dozens of unread messages awaited, mostly spam and newsletters. But one stood out, subject line, "From Mom, please." It had been sent through a friend's email address, likely because she knew he was avoiding her direct messages. He clicked it. The message was long, disjointed, emotionally charged. She described how her health had been declining, how she hadn't slept well in weeks, how the stress of losing both her husband and her son was too much to bear. She mentioned her prescriptions running low, how the power company had threatened to disconnect service. She added that Ethan had been colder than expected, and she didn't understand why both of her boys were treating her this way. There was no mention of the will, no acknowledgement of David's years of support, Only layered appeals, some subtle, some blatant, all designed to provoke one thing: guilt. At the end of the message, a final line: "I don't know what I did to deserve this." David read it 3 times. Then he closed the browser. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel pulled toward her distress. He didn't feel obligated to fix it. The emotional chains had been worn too thin, their weight no longer binding. What he felt instead was a strange kind of sorrow, not for her, but for the years he had spent trying to earn something that had never been his to claim. Love, real love, didn't require proof or payment. The next day, Ethan called again. David let it go to voicemail. This time, the message was short and tight with frustration. "Mom saying you're ignoring her completely. She called me crying for an hour. If you're not going to help, fine. But at least talk to her before she ends up in a hospital." It was a final card, the one that always worked before. Threaten illness, threaten collapse. Make her pain his responsibility. David didn't reply. He opened his laptop, found a local therapist accepting new patients, and booked a session. Then he poured himself a glass of water, stepped onto his balcony, and watched the city in silence. Let them tell their story. He would live his. The first rain in weeks fell 2 days later, tapping against David's apartment windows with a slow, steady rhythm. He had taken the day off again, this time not out of exhaustion, but from a strange sense of urgency he couldn't explain. Something unfinished lingered, a question left hanging somewhere between Ethan's attempt at reconciliation and his mother's escalating desperation. The box. He had barely touched it since the night it arrived, since the photograph spilled out and the Polaroid with its cryptic message had left him unsettled. It had remained on the corner of the kitchen table, partly forgotten, partly avoided. But now, under the gray sky and with the silence of the rain outside, David pulled the box toward him. He sifted through the photos first, moving past the familiar ones: birthday parties, family vacations, a couple of school events where he remembered standing off to the side. He paused on one picture, a candid shot of him as a teenager, sitting on the bookstore floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes during a move. His father was behind in the frame, barely visible, holding a clipboard. There was no smile, just movement, work. It wasn't affection that had defined their bond. It was labor. Beneath the stack of photos were old letters. Some were folded into crisp quarters, others sealed in envelopes with faded stamps. Most were addressed to Linda and James Reynolds, dated from the early 80s through the mid-90s. One envelope, thicker than the rest, had no return address and simply said David on the front. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 letters, each written in a distinct, shaky hand, his father's. The ink was blotchy in places, the paper slightly yellowed at the corners. They weren't dated. But from the content, David guessed they had been written years ago, probably shortly after the business failed and the financial burden fell on him. The first letter read more like a confession than a message. "David, if you're reading this, it means I never had the courage to say it to your face. I don't know when I started relying on you more than I should have. Maybe it was after the business collapsed. Maybe even before that. The truth is, you were always dependable, always the one I knew would step up. And maybe that's why I never thanked you, because I convinced myself you didn't need it. But you did, and I failed you. You didn't just save the house. You saved us. And I'm sorry I let it become expected instead of appreciated. I was too proud to admit we needed help, and too ashamed to admit you were the one giving it." The letter ended without a signature. The second one was shorter, but heavier in tone. "I told your mother we should have changed the will. I told her, but she was afraid. Not of you, of what it would mean to admit we had been wrong all these years. She couldn't bear the thought of you knowing how much she relied on you, while never giving you what you deserved. She always adored Ethan. I did too in my own way, but adoration doesn't pay the bills. And it doesn't mean much when someone's already left the room." The third letter was the hardest to read. "You were the better man, David. You always were. And I didn't say it while I had the chance." David sat still for a long time after reading them, the letters spread out across the table. He didn't cry. The tears had dried out weeks ago, but he felt something raw press against his chest, a mixture of validation and grief. The words he had waited his whole life to hear had come too late. But they were real, not imagined, not invented in his own mind to soothe the pain. His father had seen it, had known, and that mattered more than he expected. He placed the letters carefully back in the envelope, then reached into the bottom of the box. There, beneath a few old tax documents and newspaper clippings, was a manila folder with a single word written in blue pen, Ethan. He opened it cautiously. Inside were legal documents, early drafts of the will, financial disclosures, letters to the family lawyer. He flipped through them, eyes narrowing as he saw Ethan's name again and again. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note clipped to the final page. James, are you sure about this? If you're doing it to keep peace, I understand. But this structure leaves you exposed. If Ethan decides to liquidate, Linda will be left without protection unless you include a clause of survivorship or retain partial ownership. At the very least, consider a trust. The letter was signed by the family attorney. David sat back, absorbing the implication. They had known. His parents had been warned. They were told Ethan might act in his own interest, that his mother could be left vulnerable, that changes should be made, and they chose not to act. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision, and now she was pleading with David to save her from the consequences. His fingers curled around the edge of the folder, not from anger, but from something deeper, a realization that he had been treated not as a son, but as a contingency, a safety net, a quiet answer to every storm they never prepared for. And now the storm had come. The rain outside intensified as he closed the folder and returned everything to the box. He taped it shut this time, sealing it with quiet finality. He placed the box on a shelf in his closet, accessible, but no longer on display. That night, he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out a fresh journal and wrote, September 23rd. It's the first time I feel like I'm not someone's backup plan. I don't know what happens next, but I know it won't be more of the same. I don't owe anyone my silence anymore. He set the pen down. Then he opened his laptop and began searching for properties again. Small apartments on the edge of the city. He filtered for sunlight balconies and hardwood floors. Nothing extravagant, just something that belonged only to him. For the first time, he saw it not as escape, but as a beginning. It began with a listing. A friend of Claire's, who worked part-time at a local real estate agency, texted David with a screenshot of a newly posted home for sale in the Willow Creek neighborhood. The address jumped out at him instantly, 1217 Willow Creek Lane, his childhood home. The photo in the listing showed the house from an angle he remembered well. The front lawn trim but bare, the porch swing where his father used to drink coffee at dawn still hanging. A banner at the top of the page read, newly available, ideal for first-time buyers or investors. David stared at the screen in silence. There had been no conversation, no notice, no call from Ethan, nothing. He clicked through the photos. Each one revealed a slice of a life now gutted. Empty rooms, clean but sterile. The living room wall where David's old piano once stood had been repainted. His father's study had been staged as a reading nook. The kitchen looked untouched, but the little marks on the countertop where his mother used to keep her spice rack were gone. He read the description. This charming single-family home is located in a quiet, desirable neighborhood with great access to schools and parks. Recently cleared for sale. Great opportunity for quick closing. His chest tightened. Recently cleared. Ethan had acted. Quietly. Quickly. David called Claire. She picked up immediately. I was just about to call you, she said. I saw it too. When? David asked, his voice tight. This morning. I think he's been working with a private realtor. Not local. Out of L.A. David's hand curled into a fist. And Mom? She didn't know, Claire said. She found out today. She called me in tears. I think she thought Ethan would wait, or at least talk to her before making it public. David exhaled through his nose, tried to steady the rising heat in his chest. And she still has no legal claim? Claire hesitated. Not if the title was transferred solely to Ethan. No trust, no survivorship clause. The house is his. David thanked her and hung up. Then, after a long moment of quiet rage, He dialed Ethan. Voicemail. He didn't bother leaving a message. Instead, he drove, without knowing exactly where he was going. He found himself in front of the house by early evening. It looked smaller than he remembered, the same way things shrink when you stop worshiping them. The for sale sign stood at the edge of the yard. Fresh, professional. A QR code printed on the side. He parked across the street and sat in the car for a long time. After a few minutes, the front door opened. Ethan stepped out. He did look surprised to see David, almost like he had been expecting him. He walked down the steps with that same old, unhurried stride, hands in his jacket pockets. David got out of the car and crossed the street. Ethan didn't wait for small talk. It was going to happen eventually, he said. I figured sooner was better than later. The market's strong. You could have called me, David said. I didn't think you'd care, Ethan replied, too quickly. You made it clear you wanted nothing to do with any of this. David's jaw tightened. That doesn't mean I wanted to find out through a real estate listing. Ethan shrugged. You weren't going to stop it. Neither was she. She has nowhere to go. That's not my fault. Ethan snapped, his tone suddenly sharp. I told her to start looking months ago. I even offered to help her find a place. She refused, said it wasn't time. David stepped closer. And now, Ethan looked away. Now it's time. They stood in silence for a few seconds, tension hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Then Ethan added quieter, I didn't want this to be a fight, David. I just want to be done. I've got my own life. I don't want to be the one holding the torch for a house nobody wanted until it was about to be taken away. David blinked. You think I didn't want it? Ethan said nothing. David continued. I paid that mortgage for over a year. I held it together when no one else did. You think I wanted it for me? I wanted it to mean something. And now you're gutting it like it's a hotel investment. Ethan's expression hardened. Spare me the martyr act. You chose to pay those bills. Nobody forced you. If you wanted recognition for that, you should have asked for it. David laughed, cold and bitter. Right, because that worked so well in this family. Ethan turned, walking toward the steps. The sale goes through next month. I'm signing the paperwork in a few days. The buyers are already doing inspections. David followed him with his eyes. And Mom, he asked. Ethan stopped at the top step, turned halfway. She has to figure it out, same as the rest of us. Then he disappeared inside. David stood in the yard for another minute, staring up at the house. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a hollow monument to choices made in silence and defended with arrogance. He got back in his car and drove to his apartment. When he walked inside, the first thing he did was pull out the letters from his father again. He read the one that spoke about Ethan, the warnings, the doubts. If Ethan decides to liquidate, they had known. They had chosen anyway. He opened his laptop and typed an email to the real estate agent listed on the posting. Subject: 1217 Willow Creek Lane. Body: Hello. I'm inquiring about the property listed at 1217 Willow Creek Lane. I have personal interest in the home and some background I'd like to discuss before the sale proceeds. Please let me know if you're available for a conversation. Regards, David Reynolds. He wasn't sure what he was trying to accomplish. He didn't want the house. Not anymore. But he wanted to understand the terms, the scope, the full shape of the loss. He needed closure, not from Ethan, not from his mother, but from the house itself, because soon it would be gone, and with it, every illusion he had spent decades holding on to. It was a Tuesday afternoon when David opened the door to find his mother standing in the hallway, suitcase in one hand, coat draped over her other arm, eyes swollen and face hollow. She didn't knock. She didn't call in advance. She just stood there, a shell of the woman who had, for so many years, wielded guilt like a weapon. Now, her expression was stripped of pride, defenses shattered. He didn't speak. He simply stepped aside and watched as she walked in without a word. The sound of the suitcase wheels on the hardwood floor echoed louder than it should have. She stopped just inside the living room and stood still, looking around as if unfamiliar with the space, even though she had visited once years ago. David closed the door. He stayed silent, watching her, waiting, not with resentment, but with an emotional distance carved by too many betrayals. The woman who stood before him now wasn't the same one who had coldly demanded mortgage payments, or who had painted herself the victim to strangers. This was someone else, frail, disoriented, broken in a way that had nothing to do with money. Her voice, when it came, was low, shaky. I didn't know where else to go. David nodded once. How did you get here? I took a cab. Claire helped me pack. He noticed her hand trembling as she set the suitcase down. The silence between them was unbearable, not because it was empty, but because of everything it carried. Finally, she looked up at him. I know I'm not welcome here. I know what I did. He didn't respond. He moved past her and sat on the couch, gesturing toward the armchair opposite him. She lowered herself into it slowly, her joints stiff, as if the weight of her choices had aged her beyond her years. I didn't expect him to sell the house, she said. I thought he'd give me time. I thought he'd understand. He's never had to understand, David said. That's how you raised him. She flinched, but didn't deny it. They sat in silence again. The tension wasn't sharp anymore. It had softened into something heavier, like smoke after fire. I told myself I was protecting you, she said. That's what I kept repeating. Every time we didn't change the will, every time I told Ethan he was the one man to carry on the legacy, every time I asked you for help without saying thank you. David looked at her, unmoved. Protecting me from what? Her answer came too quickly. From resenting us, from becoming bitter, from hating what we became. I thought if we didn't burden you with ownership, you'd be free. He gave a short, sharp laugh. I wasn't free. I was used. I know that now. No, he said. You've known it for years. You're only saying it now because you have nowhere else to go. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She just sat still, as though bracing herself against his truth. I didn't come here for pity, she said. I came because I need to say it. I was wrong. He studied her carefully, trying to find the manipulation, the guilt tactic, the rehearsed speech. But there was nothing rehearsed about her posture. She looked like a woman who had run out of tactics. For the first time, perhaps in her entire life, she was standing in front of her son without a script. I don't know how to fix what I did, she whispered. But I know it started long before your father got sick. Long before the house, the debt. It started when I decided to love you quietly and love Ethan loudly. I thought it would balance, that you didn't need it as much. He didn't say anything. He just breathed deeply, slowly. Do you want me to leave? She asked. He shook his head. Not tonight. She nodded. Thank you. He pointed to the small guest room. You can sleep there. There are fresh towels in the closet. The door doesn't close all the way, but it's quiet. She rose, moved slowly, and rolled the suitcase down the hallway. David stayed on the couch for a long time after, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel satisfied. What he felt was something quieter, grief, maybe, not for her, but for the version of himself that had waited so long to be seen. That night, he lay awake in bed, the sound of the wind moving through the city. Somewhere in the guest room, he imagined she was staring at the ceiling too, listening to the same sounds, feeling the same silence. In the morning, she made coffee. She didn't ask how he liked it. She just made it. When he walked into the kitchen, she handed him a mug without speaking. He took it. They drank quietly. After a few minutes, she said, I won't stay long. I'll find a place. Claire said she might help me look. David nodded. I'll help, but not the way I used to. Her lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smile. I don't expect you to. I want to do this right. For the rest of the day, they didn't talk much. She cleaned the kitchen. He answered work emails. They coexisted. Not as mother and son in traditional sense, but as two people occupying the same space after a war neither of them had truly won. That night, as they sat in the living room watching the news, she turned to him. I miss him, she said, but I think I missed a man I thought he was more than the one he really was. David glanced at her. He wrote me letters, ones he never sent. Her eyes widened. He did. David nodded. He said he failed me. that he saw what I'd done, that he knew it was too late to change it. She didn't cry. Instead, she said something he didn't expect. I wish I had letters to give you, but I only have this moment, and I don't know if it's enough. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in his adult life, he saw her as something other than a figure of power or pain. He saw her as human, and maybe that was the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, but recognition. The days that followed were slow, careful, and unspoken. David didn't offer to extend his mother's stay, but he didn't set a deadline either. She moved quietly through the apartment, occupying corners rather than claiming space. It was clear she understood the temporary nature of her presence, and more importantly, the fragility of whatever was now forming between them. David returned to work, logging in remotely, keeping his routine as normal as possible. He didn't tell anyone that his mother was living in the spare room. When colleagues asked how things were going, he gave vague responses and shifted the conversation. He wasn't hiding out of shame. He was simply too tired to explain what couldn't be explained in a sentence or two. In the early mornings, she would sit on the small balcony wrapped in a sweater, drinking coffee in silence. David never joined her. He gave her that time alone. He needed his own space too. Despite the physical proximity, the emotional distance remained. Claire visited twice. She brought groceries the first time, a list of affordable apartments the second. David stayed in his room during those conversations, letting them talk without interruption. He knew his mother needed someone to help her navigate the logistics of a new life, someone who wasn't him. One evening, while David was preparing dinner, she approached him holding a manila folder. Her posture was straighter than usual, her voice steady. "I met with a legal advisor today," she said. "One of the women from church referred me. She helped me get my name off any of the remaining utility accounts." Claire also co-signed for a new checking account. "I'll be opening a P.O. box this week." David nodded, unsure what to say. "I'm not going to make this your responsibility again," she added. "I mean that." He placed the bowl on the counter. "Thank you." She stood there for a moment longer, then placed the folder on the table. Inside are copies of everything. Just for transparency, he didn't open it. "I appreciate it," he said. After dinner, they sat in the living room. The television was on, but neither of them was really watching. The air between them had changed. It wasn't comfortable yet, but it wasn't hostile either. It was a kind of quiet that comes after an earthquake. Everything's still standing, but not where it used to be. "I've been looking at places in Edgewater," she said. "Small units, one bedroom. Some have elevators. Not much sunlight, but it's affordable." "Edgewater's a good area," David replied. "Close to the grocery stores. Buses run often." "I might take the one with the bay window," she added, "even if I can't afford curtains for it yet." He turned to her. "You don't have to rush." "I do," she said firmly. "Not because of you. Because I need to prove to myself I can live without waiting for someone to catch me." He respected that. That night, she packed one of the suitcases again, not to leave, but to begin sorting. She folded clothes neatly, divided documents into envelopes, arranged medications into label bags. She was preparing herself mentally, emotionally, for a beginning she should have faced long ago. The next morning, David took a call from a property manager. He had been searching for a new apartment of his own, wanted to leave his current one behind. The place had started to feel like a bridge between lives, a halfway point no longer needed. The manager mentioned an available unit across town, modest but sunlit, quiet but not isolated. He scheduled a tour. When he hung up, he found his mother in the kitchen, drying a cup she hadn't used. She looked up. "You're moving?" she asked. "I'm considering it." She nodded once. "That's good." No questions. No guilt. Just acknowledgement. Later that day, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a note from Ethan. "I finalized the sale. The house belongs to a new family now. I'm back in L.A. I know you probably never want to speak to me again, but for what it's worth, I hope you get what you need. Not what they promised you, but what you actually deserve." David didn't respond. He didn't need to. The door was closed. That night, As he sat on the couch reading through listings, his mother approached with a small photo frame in her hand. It was one of the few things she had brought with her, a picture of the three of them, taken over 20 years ago, when David was barely a teenager. His father was seated, Ethan beside him, and David stood behind, off to the right, barely touching the frame. "I've kept this for years," she said. "But I see now, you were always outside the picture, even when you were in it." He looked at the photo. "I don't want it anymore," she said. "But I don't want to throw it away either." David took the frame, set it gently in the bottom drawer of his desk. "Then it'll stay here," he said. A few days later, she moved out. Claire helped her settle into the new apartment. David didn't go, not because he didn't care, but because some chapters deserved to end quietly. He stood in his now empty guest room, looking at the made bed, the folded blanket, the pillow still slightly indented. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel sadness either. He felt space, real clean space. Something he hadn't known he needed so badly. He picked up his phone, dialed the property manager, and confirmed his interest in the new place. Then he packed, not in a rush, but with purpose. Clothes, books, dishes, nothing extravagant, just the essentials. He was moving, not to run, but to restart. The old apartment, like the old life, had served its purpose. Now it was time for something his. Unburdened, unconditional. His mother called later that evening. Just one sentence. "I understand if you don't want to talk, but I want you to know I'm proud of you." He didn't reply, but he didn't hang up either. He let her voice linger a moment longer. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "I think I'm proud of me too." David moved into his new apartment on a quiet Sunday morning in early spring. The streets were still damp from the night's rain, and the sky had that muted glow only found in the hours just after sunrise. The movers arrived early, 2 college kids with worn baseball caps and efficient hands. By noon, the boxes were stacked neatly in the corner of the living room, the furniture arranged just enough of the space to feel livable. He stood alone in the center of it all, the keys to the old place now resting on the kitchen counter, waiting to be dropped off later. The silence was different here, clean, full of potential, not haunted by old words or unpaid debts. For the first time in years, there was no weight pressing down on him, no obligation waiting to be met. He unpacked slowly, deliberately. He placed books on the shelf one by one, hung coats with care, sorted kitchenware into drawers without rushing. Every object placed was a decision. Every corner claimed was a quiet declaration. "This is mine." That evening, after a long shower and a modest dinner, he stood on his new balcony with a glass of water, watching the city in motion below. People walked dogs, children rode bikes, couples wandered aimlessly, hands entwined. The world moved on. So had he. His phone vibrated inside. He left it, not out of avoidance, but because he didn't feel the need to rush anymore. When he finally picked it up, the screen showed a text from his mother. "How's the new place?" He stared at the words, unsure of how to answer. After a few moments, he typed, "It's quiet. It's good." No punctuation. No over-explanation. A few minutes later, her reply came. "I'm glad. You deserve quiet." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Later that week, he received a formal envelope in the mail. No return address, just his name written neatly across the front. Inside was a letter, handwritten but unfamiliar. As he read, he realized it was from one of the church women who had briefly intervened during his mother's call for help. The tone was respectful, apologetic even. "David, I wanted to reach out because I feel I made assumptions without understanding the full picture. Your mother has told me some things recently, about the past, about your role in keeping things together. I believe she's starting to see it now. I don't know if it helps, but she's trying. Not for show, not for pity. For the first time, I think she's trying to carry her own weight. Whatever you choose going forward, I hope you know you were never invisible. Even when they failed to say it, you mattered." He folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. It wasn't life-changing, but it was real. And sometimes reality was enough. The weeks passed. He settled into his routine. He discovered a new cafe a few blocks away, and made it his Sunday ritual. He started therapy, speaking not only about the past, but about the future, about what it meant to build a life for yourself, not out of reaction to others' failures, but out of your own desires. He even reconnected with Marcus from Seattle, daily texts turning into weekly calls. They talked about travel, books, what it meant to start again at 35. One afternoon, while reorganizing his closet, David found a Polaroid again, the one of Ethan and his father in front of the house. The message scrawled on the back still made no more sense than it had before. For everything you'll never understand. He looked at it for a while. Then he placed it in a photo box, deep in a drawer. Some things didn't need to be solved. Some answers weren't owed. One day, months later, his mother called, not to ask for anything, but simply to talk. She told him about her small apartment in Edgewater, how she'd started attending community dinners, how she had found a job helping at the local library twice a week. She didn't use the call to reminisce. She didn't bring up the past. Instead, she said something that stayed with him. I used to think that asking for help made me weak, but I've learned that asking for forgiveness is harder, and receiving it is not a right, it's a grace. David didn't answer right away. Then he said, I'm not there yet. I know, she replied softly, but I'll be here when you are. If you are. It was the first time she'd ever left the door open without stepping through it herself, and that mattered more than she knew. Months turned to seasons. Ethan stayed gone. No calls, no messages. The house was no longer a topic, no longer wound. It became something else, an artifact, like an old book you once read and no longer needed to revisit. David, in time, began inviting people into his new life. Not family, but friends. People who saw him as he was, not for what he could provide. He hosted dinners, joined photography group, even went on a few dates, nothing serious, just new connections built without history weighing him down. One afternoon, while helping Claire move a donated bookshelf into her living room, she paused and looked at him. You look different, she said. Lighter. He smiled. I feel different. You did the hardest thing, she added. What's that? You let go. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. On the anniversary of his father's death, he visited the cemetery alone, not with flowers, not with tears. He stood by the gravestone, hands in his pockets, and simply said, I know you saw me, even if you never said it. Then he walked away, not angry, not broken, just done. Later that night, he wrote a single line in his journal. Forgiveness doesn't always come with a reunion. Sometimes, it's just a piece of not needing one. David no longer felt like a man abandoned by his family. He felt like a man who had rescued himself, not with revenge, not with bitterness, but with clarity, and that, in the end, was the only inheritance that ever mattered.